Hi, everybody. We're going to spend the bulk of the day with me kind of walking you through this place in Buenos Aires known as the ESMA, or the Escuela de Mecánica de la Armada. You take the ES, the M, and the A to create ESMA in there to make it kind of work out in Spanish. And the ESMA is also known as the Argentine Auschwitz. And this was the place in which people were taken after they were disappeared. Okay, so to be disappeared was just kind of like taken off the street with no arrest, no trial, no nothing, just kind of thrown into a van and called it, or something along those lines. And then they generally, in Buenos Aires, would have been brought here. They would have been tortured. They would have been transferred, which is a euphemism. We'll talk, or you've read all about, like, kind of the different language of the process and the euphemisms of the process, and so you know what transferred means. They would have been transferred, and then if this was the place where, as we talked about earlier, pregnant women would have been forced to live here until they gave birth, and then they would have had their kids taken away from them, and they would have been transferred or so. Um, and interestingly, this sits right in the heart of Buenos Aires. I mean, it is one of those things that, like, you can't miss. You can't, like, think like, oh, nobody knew about this, blah blah blah. To give you an idea, the 1978 World Cup was played in Argentina. This was kind of the height of the junta's power, and Argentina won that. And the final was played in River Plate Stadium. River Plate Stadium is, depending on your point of view, between about 700 meters to about a kilometer away from the ESMA. So when the 1978 World Cup was being played, there were people being taken in, tortured, and killed about a kilometer away from where all of Argentina and the world was kind of celebrating this, like, supposed great moment in, like, world sports, if that makes sense. So this is the outside of the ESMA. This PowerPoint is going to take you through, or sorry, this YouTube lecture, whatever you want to call it, is going to take you through the ESMA. On the side, you can see them talking about kind of state terrorism and, like, what the overarching ground of the ESMAs were and kind of the background here. The complex is about a couple, 2 to 3, maybe even 4 square blocks. You have this main building right here, and then you have a bunch of other side buildings and other stuff on it and stuff along those lines. You guys have seen this slide before, so I really won't spend a lot of time on it. This is just reminding you that, like, the Dirty War was a massive tragedy on a number of levels, but the thing it was most infamous for was abducting pregnant women, imprisoning them, murdering them, and giving their newborn babies to worthy Argentines. And this lecture, at the end of this, will talk about kind of how that worked and what that meant and the results of that, et cetera, et cetera. And just a reminder, only about 25% of the 400 children plus who were abducted had had their true identity discovered. This is really, really powerful. This is the outside of the ESMA complex or so right here. And all it is just pictures of various people, from priests, as you can see down on the bottom in blue around blue, et cetera, et cetera. The guy's got a collar on if you can't see it well, to other people who would be considered social or liberal activists. Originally, this was, the junta was supposedly disappearing and rounding up people that were hardcore communists, but in the end, it turned into anybody they didn't like, and then it turned into anybody who might have any type of, like, kind of like liberal agenda. For example, the state should provide more for the people because they haven't throughout history, et cetera, et cetera. Those would be, like, grounds for the disappeared. And so the whole, like, outside of the complex is just kind of like wallpapered with pictures of the disappeared to give you an idea of, like, these people that were snatched off the streets were real people with real lives and real things that really had this happen. So this slide you've also seen before as well. This is the original junta of the last dictatorship of the 6 dictatorships Argentina had in the 20th century. The junta would actually change its leaders a number of times. The head of the army, head of the navy, head of the air force would change, et cetera, et cetera. But these guys were there through the bulk of it for the first 5 years. And you have Agonasti on the left, or on the right, who really is kind of inconsequential. That's why he's about this size of, just a couple inches or so there. But the people that really mattered, Jorge Rafael Videla in the center, the head of the army and the president of Argentina during this time, and through the height of the junta and the disappearances, et cetera, et cetera. A man who, even when he was tried again in 2014, was talking about how he was literally saving Argentina and therefore Western civilization from communism and restoring Christianity and Catholicism to the world. That was his goal. And then Emilio Massera on the left, the person who was really the true orator of the process. And he's the one that you read about when you read about, the language of the process and the euphemisms that were used and how this worked, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and now we get into new information, and this slide is going to talk to you about the process, or the national reorganization process, or what I should be able to say in Spanish, but I have butchered on 3 separate occasions the third word, and I'm not going to attempt this again. Okay, so essentially along the lines of Proceso de Reorganización Nacional, or the National Reorganization Process, or what became known as simply the process, was the euphemism, and this is important. This is where English dovetails with history. Okay, it was a euphemism developed by its grand orator, and that's why I had you guys read about the language of the process, Emilio Massera, for the state-sanctioned terror that occurred under the junta between 76 and 83. Okay, when the disaster in the Falkland Islands led to the collapse of military rule and the return of democracy. So in 83, as we'll talk about at the end, that was the end of this thing. The state terror, which involved abductions, tortures, and transfers, we'll get to transfers in a second, which were a euphemism for drug flights of death, were directed at leftist and communist groups in an effort to, and this was literally what Vidala and Massera said on multiple occasions, save Argentina and Western civilization from World War III. So let's begin thinking about it from there. That is what you're going to bat with if you are the people in this situation. I am not excusing a damn thing in the same way that, like, social Darwinism, massive racism, etc., does not excuse what occurred in the early 20th century. I'm just explaining that's what they're going to bat with. Save Argentina and Western civilization from World War III. This was during the height of the U.S.'s anti-communism policy in Latin America, known as Operation Condor. A minimum of 9,000 people, but to be honest, no more than 30,000. 30,000 is really kind of a low number. Some people go as high as 60, were disappeared during this time, snatched up off the streets, never to be seen again. No trial, just literally no even grave, no like funeral, anything. Where'd they go? We have no idea. They must have run away. They disappeared. That was what was told over and over. Oh, they must have run to Paraguay. They must have run off to Uruguay. They must have run to Brazil. Like, don't worry about them, blah, blah, blah. The terror was greatest from 76 to 79, and the junta was most popular when Argentina had a decent economy and when they won the World Cup in 1978, which they hosted. And, like, as frivolous as that might seem, the intersection of sports and politics really, really matters here. You're looking right there at what they call euphemisms of death or transfers. These were kind of death flights that we'll get to in a second, as well as pictures from a special exhibit when I was in Argentina in 2018, most recently, that kind of dealt with how like the ESMA and the process and the World Cup kind of related. I found the bottom right one, that really small one, kind of harrowing because it really takes like what is the like World Cup trophy and kind of makes it into like concentration camp or Auschwitz style, like, um, uh, fences in order to like show like the problem that the junta was going through and the issues that were going on and the fact that the world was pretty much ignoring it.
Yo seguía gritando. Sí, recuerdo un grito que de repente yo escuché que era mi grito. Me introdujeron en un cuartito muy pequeño. Bueno, ahí sí me dan un número. 261. 88. Me ponen grilletes en las piernas. Encapuchado, con esposado y con grilletes. Me hacen acostar sobre un colchón. Al lado de una cama y donde fui torturado. Máquinas, eléctricas. Eléctrica permanentemente las 24 horas del día. Acá tenemos todo el tiempo del mundo. El tiempo no existe.
The process, which was this massive network of clandestine camps throughout Argentina, was the euphemism that Emilio Massera and others came up for in kind of the language of the dirty war. The thing that you read about when it talked about like the various kind of like ways that language was manipulated in order to make the dirty war or force the dirty war to actually work here. And what this was this network of camps that you'll either see in 1 second or just saw a second ago. I'm having a hard time figuring out how this video is playing when, and I've tried it about 18 times. So if you see the video first, then you'll get my information after, and if you get the information first, you'll see it after. The video will show you the network of camps, along with the like kind of support that the junta had and the popularity it had at various times. But the network of camps was meant to eradicate left-wing groups. And originally this was meant as like communists, and it started mainly kind of with like people that actually were hardcore communists, but then that quickly morphed within like weeks onto like anybody with leftist tendencies, any type of socialist, anybody who even had like had gone as far as like to debate and say, hey, maybe we should treat poor people a little bit better, or read the works of Che, or gone as far as to like protest against like bad labor practices, either in Argentina or somewhere else, anybody like that was eventually kind of like grabbed as part of the process. And since Argentina is kind of in the cone down at the bottom of South America, and Operation Condor had been occurring in other places like Chile, Paraguay, stuff like that, a number of people had kind of illegally like snuck into Argentina as a way to avoid other dirty war in other places. And that just gave Massera and others a excuse to go after immigrants, to go after people that or people that they seem to have, quote unquote, that didn't have their Catholic Western Christian values. So eventually, this is going to lead to anti-Semitism, and there'll be a lot of like anti-Jewish things going on during this time. I mean, anybody that didn't fit into what would be seen in kind of the traditional role was liable to be round up by the process, and that just expanded more and more as the junta got more and more powerful, and things went further. And at the epicenter of all this networks of camps was the ESMA, sometimes called the Argentine Auschwitz. Okay, so this next slide starts to get us into the actual like torture and death of the ESMA, right? And so what happened is that starting in '76, people began to disappear. They were literally taken off the streets by the local military, or sorry, by the local police or the military, at school, in their homes, at night, literally like the early Nazi abductions, like Nabel and Nacht. And if you look in the bottom right, you can see a political cartoon calling for a boycott of the '78 World Cup and comparing Videla to Hitler for the various abductions and stuff like that that occurred. And then after that, they'd generally be thrown into the back of the van, and then they would be taken into the ESMA. And when they got there, they would be thrown into a hood pretty much immediately, like literally like put kind of like a hood on top of them so they couldn't see anything. And then they would be taken to the basement. And in the basement, they would go down the stairs. You can see those on the bottom in the center there. And then they would come into this place called the lift, which basically was like, a big wall in which they, like, usually they would walk them right through and slam their heads on it on purpose just to give them their introductory torture. And from there, they would then kind of throw them onto, and that's what you can see in the center. By the way, what you see in the top kind of center up there is my wife, who's exactly 5 feet tall, to give you perspective for how high like the lift is, that area right there, and where they'd slam their heads into it. And then they take them and they throw them onto some type of like, metal rack or metal sheet or something like that, and the torture would begin. And to be honest, as crude as it sounds, but it's worth noting, the torture generally consisted of various types of freezing torture, staying away, waterboarding, stuff like that. But most infamously, taking the person, stripping them naked, and taking a cattle prod or electric shock to their genitals. And that was generally the way that like torture occurred in this time. Once somebody had been tortured, they fell into one of two categories. There were those that were selected for immediate transfer and those that were going to stay in the ESMA. Okay, those that stayed in the ESMA were put in a place called the hood. There was a big hood and a little hood, and they were called that because they were not only at the top of the building, kind of like the hood or the attic, etc., but you literally had to wear a hood about 23.5 hours a day during that time. So that's what they became known as. Those that were in the hood could be transferred at any time. And what transferring meant was this, and that's what this page is about, is this is about flights of death. Okay? What they did to these people, when I've said this, and I've said death flights and transferred, was the following. Okay? That was the dreaded euphemism for death. Prisoners would be taken into a place where they would be drugged with pentobarbital, okay, drug them unconscious. This is actually one of the 3-drug cocktail that we give to criminals who are going to be executed in the United States, to give you an idea. And it knocks you out, okay? Then they would be stripped naked as they were knocked out, and they would be loaded into a plane. Okay, and that plane would then drop them alive but unconscious into the Rio de la Plata, which is the big river or big like kind of river slash delta area that separates Uruguay from Argentina, in that area, etc., and that was what was known as transferred flights of death. And there were a number of people that were taking flights of death, and there are in the 5-figure bodies at the bottom of the Rio de la Plata who were just kind of like, pushed off in this situation. And that was the way they killed people. Now, we should note, and this is why I bring this up, is that they chose this method of death, and Vidal even said this because it was approved by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church kind of quasi was okay with this dictatorship because of the conservatism and the anti-communism involved, and so as a result, the clergy accepted this as a merciful death. Vidal even said, and Massera said at one point, if we'd taken out people and shot them, the Catholic Church would have had a problem with that. They couldn't deal with that. If we'd, just like hang them or something like that, would have been a problem. But, if we transfer them, we've got this not nice, sorry, we've got this quote unquote euphemism, and then we push them out, etc., etc., well, that's something they can deal with. Having said that, at this time, I would be remiss if I did not note the following, okay, and it's just worth a note. During this time, a very, very, very high-ranking clergy member in Argentina who was incredibly popular was a man by the name of Jorge Bergoglio. You might know him now as Pope Francis I. While there is not a ton of evidence that Bergoglio knew exactly what was going on at this time, he was a very high-ranking official, and there is tons of evidence that large swaths of the Catholic Church knew exactly what was going on. And so, as a result, people have not dug into this and not really touched on it, but, because the Pope is so popular. But there is some evidence that the Pope was aware of this. And if you're looking for something to do during quarantine, I would highly recommend watching Two Popes on Netflix. It deals with that entirely and, how he feels as a result of that. Yeah. Okay, for those that managed to survive the initial transfer for whatever reason, and aside for the pregnant women, it could have been any number of reasons. They didn't think that they had the right person. Sometimes they would round up people who were actually not political prisoners in any way whatsoever, but were just flat out Jewish or something along those lines. Because remember, you had massive amounts of anti-Semitism, and then they would basically play with those or torture them. But since there wasn't an overly quote unquote good reason to transfer them, as if there were for other people, they would be left up there. Stuff like that. The waiting game began, is my overarching point. The guys got some of their clothes back, and the women, etc., etc., and they were placed in one of the hoods. And I said this earlier, the small hood and the big hood. And they got their names because not only did you have to remain in a hood for about 23 and a half hours a day, literally a physical hood, where you couldn't see anything, and the prisoners found ways to still communicate and talk to each other and stuff like that. But they were also in the attic, kind of the hood of the ESMA, if that makes sense. Prisoners had no habeas corpus or due process rights. And this was the thing, is every time somebody said, hey, where's my son, where's my daughter, etc., etc., you'd be told, are you sure they didn't run away? They're radical. They might have gone to, Bolivia, where there are more communists or something along those lines, right? But the prisoners were obviously taken, and they remained there. The ones that weren't transferred, as I said, and except for meals, they spent their entire time during lockup, and they were tortured kind of either formally, strap them to a thing and prod them with an electric prod, or informally, just hey, we're gonna slit your throats because you're horrible Jewish pigs, or you're horrible black workers or something along those lines. They would just throw, and that's my point, they would throw ridiculous insults at them that had no basis in anything other than racism, etc., right? And that's what I mean by kind of informal torture. In the end, and this is what you should be aware of, okay, of the people that came through the ESMA, all but about 5,000 of them were immediately transferred. Of those 5,000 that were not transferred, okay, about 200 survived. So, between 76 and 83, definitely some were able to earn the trust of the guards, some were able to, find labor to do and stuff like that, given secretarial jobs, privileges, etc., etc. But for the most part, you're looking at a massive, massive, massive death rate here. Now, the one exception to all this, as we've been over a couple times, or I've hinted at a couple times, was the pregnant women. And this right here is a birthing room right here. And what it says down on the bottom in there, in Spanish, translated into English, is how could children be born in a place like this? And in this room, a number, upwards of about 100, because there are about 4 or 5 birthing rooms, of pregnant women were forced to give birth. They were attended to by doctors who, let's note, knowingly did this. They knew these people were political prisoners. They helped them through. They gave them birth. They delivered their babies. And then they helped the junta take their baby away. And then after these women gave birth, their baby was taken away from them. Generally, they were with them for between 2 days and a week. They were told to write their family and explain that, like, they were going elsewhere, but the baby was safe, and blah, 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 and all this kind of BS. And then one time in the middle of the night, their baby would be taken away from them. They would be drugged up with a pentobarbital, and they would be transferred. And then their baby would be given to a quote unquote worthy family as selected by the Navy. And the vast majority of these babies have no idea this even happened to them, or that they were, their parents were disappeared in this way. This slide just lends further kind of evidence to what I was saying a second ago. And you can see on the upper right the same picture that I showed you a second ago that had the, birthing room. How could children be born in a place like this? Of about the 400 known active liberals who were disappeared who were pregnant at the time, at least 300, probably more, came to the ESMA. Records are bad, to be honest. They were taken, they were given birth, they spent about 3 days, as I said earlier, with their babies. They had to write a letter to the families, etc., etc. Here's the important thing. Of the 400-ish who gave birth to custody, one baby was given to the proper family. There is one documented case of the baby actually being given to, like, the grandparents or something along those lines, of the family who it actually was. The others were given to loyal Argentine families who were childless, with ties to the Navy. And this is the really kind of disturbing thing. There was an official list. You could find all right, this person gets it next, literally almost kind of like, Seahawks season tickets or a country club membership, as terrifying as that sounds. Right here are a couple examples of primary sources of what happened to women when they were abducted and taken there. The one on the left said she was abducted at her domicile together with her partner on November 23rd, 1977. They were members of the Peronist Youth, and they were taken to clandestine centers for detention and extermination. Alicia was 16 years old, and she was 5 months pregnant. At the end of December 1977, she was taken to the ESMA. Here she gave birth to a baby boy in the month of March 1978 and named him Juan. The delivery was assisted by naval doctor Jorge Magnacio and Sarah Solas de Ostaninsky also helped her. Alicia spent a few days with her son at the ESMA, and then she was transferred at the end of March. A few days later, the boy was given to the police officer Luis Antonio Falco and his wife Teresa Perone, who registered the boy as their own. Alicia is still missing. In 2004, Juan recovered his identity. The other one on the right side says, as a slightly, more pleasurable story in this. Marta Alvarez. She was abducted with her partner on May 26, 1976. They were both members of the Montaneros. She was 1 month pregnant. She gave birth to a boy on March 1st, 1977 in the Naval Hospital and was registered as Federico Emilio Francisco Mera. She was assisted by naval doctor Jorge Magnacio, same person as before. Marta was freed at the end of 1978, and she managed to reunite with her son. So that one's a slightly better one. You can pause it and you can read the direct primary source quotes on either of those if you want to on your own time. But this just gives you direct evidence that this did in fact happen. I said earlier that the junta reached the height of its popularity when they won the World Cup in '78. By the early '80s, 1981, '82, the Argentine economy was in a complete and total crapper. They had taken a country that in '45 was the eighth richest nation in the world and mired it in almost poverty. And in order to distract from the current situation at home, the junta decided to declare war on Britain, attacking, I know this is insane, the United Kingdom in the 80s, attacking the Falkland Islands, which exist just several miles off the coast of Argentina, but had been a British territory. The British, from a military standpoint, kicked their butt. From a social standpoint, it's kind of a British version of Vietnam, but that's not here nor there right now. The end result was that this led to the collapse of the junta, and as a result, the return of democracy in Argentina in 1983. Having said that, though, people have not given up entirely. And this is important because every Thursday at 3:30 for nearly 50 years at this point, A group of women known as the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, this is their thing right here, have protested this disappearance. Now, what these women are is this: they are the mothers of the people who were disappeared. Okay, so for example, it would have been the primary sources whose daughter was transferred and then grandson was given to somebody else. So it's a bit of a misnomer because really what they are is they're looking for their grandchildren. But you can see kind of like the elements of the protest. You can go to a protest very easily. They're scheduled, as I said, for 3:30 with interviews and everything every time in Buenos Aires. I'll show you a video in a second here. And you can see kind of some of the things they are protesting. Aside from the disappearance of the children on the right, you can see, like, death towards Yankees or genocides. I'm not saying I condone this in any way. It just kind of gives you the like total ideas of animosity that is directed at like both the junta and the people that were involved in Operation Condor. While the disappearances were terrible, it was the birthing aspect of the dirty war that led to public outcry in Argentina. And the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo are the people that I just discussed. You can see them on the right, beginning their protest right there. That says 41 years at this point. Sorry if I did the math wrong. We're looking at, so 40 years, not 50 years. As of 2018, about 111 missing children of 400, so about 27%, had been successfully united with their families. For 41 years, these people have protested, and what this has resulted to, and you can see the kind of white bonnet with the shawl on the left. That is the symbol for the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. If you've been in our office, you've definitely seen a magnet that I got from Athene last time I was in Buenos Aires that has that on there. And what this has really represented is the fact that, like, a group of women, which is massively important given that they have not been the protagonists in the historical process for the vast majority of history. A group of women were able to bring down the junta and able to lead to an international outcry and able to show this, and they have continued over and over and over again. And they have slowly gotten what they've wanted, very, very slowly. And I'll leave you with this. In a second, you'll go over to the last part, which will show you the protests of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. These are the actual mothers. I was lucky enough to be able to go to a protest on a Thursday at 3:30 last time I was in Buenos Aires, and these are the actual mothers of the people who were disappeared and whose children were given to other quote-unquote worthy Argentines. You can always see the actual mothers themselves, not just the people supporting them, but the mothers based on their kind of white shawls that you'll see. On the left, too, the left is me. We're filming in the middle of the protest in a second once you get to there. The middle is me filming from the front of the protest, the same kind of protest, which seems fairly celebratory, but still is, continuing this theme of you've taken our children from us. And then the one on the right, which I think is the most powerful, just reads out, like, aspects of, like, or not aspects, names of people who are gone, and just says missing, and they carry a sign in front of them for the 30,000 that disappeared. So take a look at the protests, and we'll go ahead and leave our understanding of the dirty wars at this point.
A la gente una bandera que diga gracias madre por ser siempre el ejemplo en la lucha popular, por no mil mujeres, por no vender la sangre de 30.000 caídos que siempre van a estar.